Okay, so I think we should start. I'm just going to start recording and we'll begin our, let me just put it on airplane. Okay. Okay, thank you for joining me, ladies. This is going to be our last shiur for the year, which I can't believe we're already at the end of 2020, basically, because I don't know, half the year just seemed to disappear over the winter months when we were in lockdown, and here we are already in December. So please God, we'll begin again in January, but let's begin our class today, and we're going to be focusing today on Hanukkah. Okay, so Hanukkah is tomorrow evening, and let's see if we can get some insights into, first of all, into the story of Hanukkah, and I'll focus specifically on certain aspects of the story and highlight those. And then we're going to obviously focus on the menorah, the oil, and try and explore some deeper insights into these parts of the Festival of Lights. So, Hanukkah. Let's try and understand a little bit the actual experience of Bnei Israel, of the Jews at this time, when it was the time of the Second Temple. So the Second Temple had already been built. Hanukkah happened approximately 200 years after Purim, and I would say we're looking at about 2,200 years ago from today. So what was going on? Bnei Israel were trying to learn Torah and keep mitzvahs, and they fell to the Assyrian Greek rulership. Now, I'm just going to refer to them going forward as the Greeks. It seemed that the Greeks did not have a problem with the Jewish nation in and of itself. Their intention, unlike at the time of Purim, was not to do away with the Jewish nation. They did not wish to physically decimate this people. However, they saw that we have a Torah that we learn. They saw that we keep mitzvahs, and they actually found that there was some of those practices that they could celebrate. Some of those practices they actually found beauty in. So if it came to learning Torah, they were happy to allow us to do it as an intellectual pursuit, as an intellectual exercise in and of itself. If it came to keeping mitzvot, they actually found that there was beauty in keeping a mitzvah, and their take on it was, why not add some of the beauty of Greek philosophy and Greek practices and mix it in a little bit with the mitzvot that we kept, in order to make it a little bit more dated. Let's say, not that it shouldn't be so dated, that it should be a little bit more with the times, and also because they thought that beauty and culture and intellect are all things to be celebrated, as well as they celebrated very much the body and the physique and the beauty of the body. And so this was the take of the Greeks. What enraged them, what really got to them to the point where they wanted to completely quell and stamp out any Jewish ritual and practice, was that we did it for the sake of fulfilling the will of God. That keeping mitzvot and learning Torah were our way of serving the supreme divine deity, or the supreme divine God. And this did not work for them. This didn't suit them. It needed to be something that fitted in with their paradigm and their way of thinking. And also, if there was a divinity to the origin of the Torah and the origin of keeping mitzvot, that meant that these things could not be changed. They were immutable, they were unchangeable. And that also did not fit in with their narrative. And so really what they were saying to the Jewish people was, learn your Torah by all means, but do not do it for the sake of God. Do it for your own personal enjoyment. Do it for your own personal intellectual endeavors and enjoyment. And this is where the conflict came in. So when we understand this, then we see that what was under threat really was our spiritual well-being. Our spiritual life as the Jewish nation was completely under threat. Because if we could sever the connection between the rituals that we do and the Torah that we learn, if we could sever the connection of these practices to God, the Greeks would have been happy. But the whole point of Jewish practice is God. It's all about God. And that's the complete focus within our religion. So then what steps did the Greeks take at this point in order that they could then stamp out our spirituality and sever that connection that we had with God? So they started with things like banning circumcision. They outlawed Shabbat. They outlawed any Torah study. The Jews were not permitted to practice the celebration of the moon, which is called Kiddush Levana. These things all became illegal or outlawed. And then Jews started to find ways to keep these mitzvot in a hidden way. They would go and hide in caves. They would do things in a secret way. And the Greeks found ways to become more and more oppressive. And ultimately, their objective really was that they wanted to humiliate the Jews, and they wanted to get us to be so intimidated by the threat that hung over us that we would give it up. Not just that, but they also hoped to draw us into their ways and their cultures and to entice us. So if you look at Jewish spirituality, which is really what they were hoping to destroy, then the center of Jewish spirituality, as we all know, is Yerushalayim and the temple. So what did they do? They built a big gymnasium next to the temple, because remember, they also worshipped the body and the physique. And they tried to get as many Jews as possible to become Hellenized, and to join the gymnasium, and to embrace Jewish culture. And unfortunately, many Jews did. Many Jews succumbed. They didn't only just succumb, but they were very taken with what was fashionable, what was popular in the day, what would curry favor in the eyes of the populace around them. Now, there was one family, which many of you are familiar with, and this was the family of the Hashmonaim. And is there any way that I can... Okay. Anyway, Sharon, is there any way that you can mute everybody else so that we won't hear any background noise? Thank you, that's much better. Okay, so now the family of the Hashmonaim was led specifically by the famous Matisyahu ben Yochanan. And he was so it was a family, a priestly family of Kohanim. And because of what was happening, they actually moved from Yerushalayim to a nearby city, and they moved to the city of Modi'in. What's very beautiful to see. Wait, Shah, can you somehow mute this background noise, please? I don't know how to do it from my side, but I need you to help me. Okay, let's see if I can do it here. No, I can only mute myself. Okay. So what's very interesting is that we see that the names of the cities in Eretz Israel today are exactly the same names that we had thousands of years ago, right? We know of Modi'in, we know of Yerushalayim, we know of Beit Lechem, and all these places that are spoken about both in the Chumash and the Tanakh, and there are still places that one can visit there today. So Matisyahu and his family moved to Modi'in, but unfortunately the Greek influence as well as the Greek oppression seeped throughout Eretz Israel. And so what came to a head, the culmination of the oppression, and one of the triggers for the Jewish people taking up arms against the Greeks is that in Modi'in, one day, the Greek soldiers came along and they demanded that the Jewish populace bring a sacrifice of a pig on one of their altars to one of their pagan gods. And the Jewish people stood in defiance against this command. But unfortunately, one Jew who had become Hellenized stood forward and offered to do this and offered to bring this sacrifice. So what happened was Matisyahu came and he killed that Jew, and then he killed all the Greek soldiers that had brought this potential sacrifice to the people. And obviously then he and his sons were under threat. And so they called on all Jews who wanted to join them in taking up arms against the Greeks, and they fled. And they fled to the surrounding mountains and hills. And this began the physical struggle between the Jews and the Greeks. Something else that I found, which is very interesting, and apparently it comes from a midrash called a midrash de Chanukah, which explains that part of the way that the Greeks were oppressing the Jews was that the Greek governor put into law a decree which was called jus primae noctis, meaning first night rights. And sadly, in ancient times, this was quite a common practice for the ruler of any city or town. And what did it entail? That the governor took what he believed was his rights, first night rights. When a Jewish bride was getting married, the governor would take her and have his way with her on the first night of her wedding, and then she would be given back to her husband. So you can imagine the horror that the people faced. And this was also one of the triggers. This was also one of the catalysts for the Jewish people taking up arms against the Greeks. Now, before we explore the actual physical battle and the victories of the Jewish people, as well as the miracle of the oil, I wanted to bring the story of one of the greatest heroines that has ever existed in the history of the Jewish people. The self-sacrifice of this woman is beyond comprehension. And as many of you know, this was Hannah, the story of Hannah and her 7 sons. And I want to bring as much detail as possible so that we can get a taste or an insight into the heroism of this particular Torah personality. So the king at the time of the Greek oppression was Antiochus. And he was clearly a madman, and he was a bloodthirsty man. He had a bloodlust. And in order to increase the humiliation and the oppression of the Jews, Hannah and her 7 sons were called to come before Antiochus. So clearly there must have been a family of prestige known as a holy family. And Antiochus had some idols built that were in the likeness of his image. So he was completely narcissistic, but he also had proclaimed himself the god. And therefore, he had these idols or these images made. And when he called on Hannah and her 7 sons to appear before him, he demanded that they bow down to the images or the idols that had been made in his likeness. There's quite a lot of detail in the Gemara about this story. And we are told that each son quoted a pasuk, a verse from the Torah, in order to justify resisting bowing down to the idols of Antiochus. And we know that there are certain mitzvot in the Torah for which we are told, or certain averas, certain sins, for which we are told, rather give up your life than do these sins. And bowing down to a false god is one of the sins that we are told we should rather give up our life for. But Antiochus was a vicious, cruel man. And so when Hannah's eldest son, I don't know the age of her eldest son, but she had 7 sons, ranging from the eldest to the youngest. The youngest was but 7 years old. When her eldest son refused to bow down, Antiochus told his soldiers to torture him in the most brutal way. They cut off his tongue, they severed both hands and feet, and then he was killed. Can you imagine the terror and the horror of this mother seeing her child go through this torture? I saw one opinion that says that after he was dismembered in this way, he was boiled in front of her. And clearly the intention of Antiochus was to intimidate and put so much fear into the rest of her sons that they would not dare to disagree, to bowing before him. And yet, despite all that they witnessed, the horror that they witnessed, each son, one after the next, refused to bow down to the idols. And each one was tortured in this most brutal way. And then the youngest child stood before Antiochus. And Antiochus clearly felt hugely humiliated and enraged that his plan was not working, that these young boys had disagreed with what he had commanded them. And therefore, he said to Hannah, I will show you mercy and give you a few moments to speak to your youngest child, 7 years old, in order to convince him to do my will so that he should not come to such a brutal end. And Hannah went to her child. She kissed him and she said the following. And she said, my child, I carried you for 9 months. She said, I fed you, I nursed you for 2 years. And I have fed you and looked after you until this day. And she counseled him, do not exchange your commitment and loyalty to God for the fleeting offerings of a king who will soon perish himself. Because Antiochus was so desperate that he offered all kinds of rewards and wealth to this child if he would simply bow before him. She kissed this child and then she said to him, go to Avraham Avinu and tell him he was told to offer 1 son. I have offered 7. Antiochus was so desperate that he called this child and he said, if you will just, I will drop my ring, and if you will just bend down to pick it up in front of the idol, I will let you go free. And the child refused. And it says that he was tortured in a more horrific way than his brothers before his mother. But she knew that moments later, every single one of her children would go to the highest, most pristine places before God himself. And so, after she witnessed the murder and torture of all 7 sons, the Gemara says she ran up to the roof and threw herself off it. And there she fell to her death amongst the dismembered bodies of all her sons. But she was a heroine. and she helped each of her children to stay faithful and loyal to God Almighty, and to get to enjoy eternity at the highest of places, in the highest heavens, for their commitment. Now, I Googled it and I looked and I found that Hannah and her 7 sons are all buried in that famous old cemetery in Tzfas. That's the cemetery where the holy Arizal is buried, and Reb Chaim Vital, his student, and many, many other great tzaddikim. And if you visit that place, it's so very beautiful. It's on a hillside, and many, many of these tombstones are actually painted in that beautiful turquoise color. It's a very Sephardi practice, that turquoise stone. And in Tzfat, which is a very, very Kabbalistic town, there are many doorways that are painted with that turquoise color, and so too many of the grave sites or the tombstones in the old cemetery. Now, I visited Tzfat, but I did not know that Hannah and her 7 sons were buried there. Otherwise, I would have specifically gone to look for this incredibly holy site. They're buried like in a little cave, which has got like a round entrance, and around the periphery of this entrance, there is also a beautiful turquoise paint, that turquoise color. And you can imagine the Kedusha, the holiness of this place, to go and visit the burial site of one of the greatest heroines in the history of the Jewish nation. So that gives us an insight into how difficult the circumstances were for Bnei Israel at this time, the incredible cruelty that they endured and they experienced. And now, let's go into a little bit of a spiritual journey. So I found a beautiful teaching by the Rebbe, the mystical teachings of Hasidus, which looks at 2 of the different places where Hanukkah is mentioned. The one is in the Talmud, and in the Talmud, when Hanukkah is spoken of, the only thing that is highlighted is actually the miracle of the oil. When Bnei Israel was victorious against the Syrian Greeks, they went into the temple and found that it had been completely defiled. There were idols that had been placed in the temple. I think they had slaughtered a pig and offered it up on the altar. And so they had to cleanse this temple and completely purify it. And once they did that, they wanted to rededicate the temple to God, and they wanted to light the 7-armed candelabra that was supposed to be lit every day in the temple. But they could not find a jug of ritually pure oil. Every single vial of oil had also been opened and therefore defiled by the Greeks. And they searched and searched until they found one jug that still had the seal of the Kohen Gadol on it. And therefore they knew this jug of oil is ritually pure. And we know the story, and therefore they used that oil to light the menorah and expected it to last for one day. And God showed the people that he was smiling on them, and he wrought a clear miracle whereby this oil lasted for 8 days. So when you look into the Tanakh, all that we've spoken about into the Talmud, all that we've spoken about in terms of the Bnei Israel taking up arms against the Greeks, and looking at the physical oppression that they endured, what is spoken about only is the miracle of the oil. How Bnei Israel went in and they finally found one little jar of ritually pure oil, and how there was a miracle for 8 days. And in a fleeting verse, we are simply told when the Hashmonaim were victorious over their enemies. But the Rebbe brings out that if you look where we say Va'al Hanisim, which is included in Birkat Hamazon, in the benching that we do when we eat bread, and it's also included, I think, daily in the Amidah over this 8-day period. I could be wrong. I didn't check it. But we say in the Birkat Hamazon, Va'al Hanisim, Va'al HaPurkan, Va'al HaGvurot, Va'al HaTeshuot, Va'al HaNiflaot she'asisa lavotenu, Va'yamim ha'hem bizman hazeh. We thank God for the miracles, for the redemption, for the mighty deeds, and for the saving acts that He wrought for our ancestors in those days at that time. And as we progress in this part of the tefillah, we actually see that what's highlighted is the physical victory, where it says that God handed over the mighty. He delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, and He delivered the evil into the hands of the righteous, and the many into the hands of the few. Because that was the situation that we were faced with at the time. We had a tiny army. They were not well armed and equipped like the Greeks at the time. And so those were miracles too, the fact that we were victorious despite all the odds against us. So we see that the Al-Hanisim prayer focuses on the physical victory. And in the Talmud, what is focused on is the spiritual victory and the miracle. And why are these two so separate? Why are they not intermingled in terms of these two sources? So, first of all, if we look at every Chag, at every festival, we are physical people, and the way that we commemorate them is through physical acts, through physical deeds. On Pesach, we eat matzah and we drink wine. If we look at Purim, we have a Seudah, we're supposed to have a festive meal, we give tzedakah, we swap gifts of food with other people. These are all very physical acts. And so too on Chanukah. How do we commemorate Chanukah? By lighting the menorah. We light a physical lamp. But let's look at Chanukah. Because of all the physical things that we can possibly do, Chanukah is connected to the most spiritual of physical phenomena. And what is that? Light. Of every physical entity that we have in this world, light is the most spiritual. So we see that the overriding emphasis of Chanukah is actually on the spiritual victory of the struggle. And that makes sense because if we look, what was under threat? Our spiritual well-being. Our spiritual connection to the Almighty was what was under threat at this time. By contrast, at Purim time, we were physically under threat. And so that is the emphasis of Chanukah. The Talmud highlights this by referring to the miracle of the oil, the spiritual aspect of this festival. And that makes so much sense. What is oil? What's the nature of oil? If you take oil and you pour it on something, whether it's paper or any material substance, oil seeps right in. It's going to absolutely go completely into the substance that you pour it on. But there again, if you pour oil and you mix it with another liquid, what happens is that it separates itself. It will float to the top. If you have in a glass oil and water, they simply don't mix. The oil elevates itself. And this represents spirituality. This is like God. God is separate. God is completely sublime and out of reach in so many ways. And yet, and we've learned this again and again, God also is infused and completely seeps into every single component of our physical reality. So that's the oil. That's what the oil represents. And that is what the Talmud is highlighting. But now the Al-Hanissim prayer, that one only focuses on the physical victory, on the heroism of our ancestors and how they overcame despite all the odds against them in a physical way. And it was that actually allowed this other miracle to happen in the temple. But the Rebbe says as follows. He says that the physical victory pales in comparison to the miracle of the 8 days of that oil lasting, despite the fact that according to nature, it should only have stayed lit for 1 day. And therefore, it's not brought into the Al-Hanissim prayer. So that, because it would simply pale by comparison, or it would be completely, it would completely become invisible next to the miracle of the oil. And therefore, the two are kept separate in order not to diminish one against the other. So what's the message for us from that beautiful teaching? What can we take away from that? And the Rebbe brings the most beautiful teaching. We are made up of body and soul. And what often happens is the body will actually subject the soul to many of its own desires. That's not how it's supposed to be. We are supposed to use the body and look after the body in order that the soul can work through the body, in order that the soul can fulfill its mission. The soul is primary. That doesn't mean, though, that we must neglect or dismiss the body. However, we see the message of Hanukkah shows us that actually there is a supremacy of the soul over the body, just like there is the supremacy of the spiritual triumph over the physical triumph at this festival. The supremacy of the soul of the body is so absolute that it can completely render the body invisible, completely insignificant. A human being, too, can have such a focus on their spiritual mission and spirituality that it can consume their entire being, so that the body becomes completely insignificant. But is this what we're taught? Is this the way that we're supposed to go forward and live our lives? No, we know. In fact, the Rebbe says that unless you're talking about a complete tzaddik, this is absolutely unrealistic. Not only unrealistic, but it is undesirable for us in terms of the way that we live. However, what can we draw out from this understanding? That each of us can have moments where we become so completely consumed with a focus on God, with our spiritual focus, that we absolutely lose ourselves to our spiritual commitment. Just like a child, you know when you see a child playing and they lose themselves completely in their game. There's nothing that they have an awareness of other than what they are focused on in that moment. It's a very, very beautiful thing, that mindfulness to that degree. So too, the Rebbe is saying, we have the potential to have those moments where we completely lose ourselves in a spiritual focus to our spiritual mission. We can have moments, whether it's in tefillah, in prayer, whether it's when we're just saying a bracha. A bracha takes, if you want to have a glass of water, and you want to say your bracha over your water, it actually takes a few seconds. And yet, people are so frightened to commit themselves to a bracha, even once a day, a few seconds out of your day, to focus on God. And when we do it with a focus and a joy, we can completely lose ourselves in God in that moment. And that allows us to shine like a menorah. And it's those moments of focus, of completely being consumed with our spiritual focus, that really rejuvenate us. They vitalize us completely. And we should embrace those opportunities. I remember learning, the Frierdiker Rebbe highlights a teaching by Eliyahu Hanavi, where he shows that the Navia Devorah, the prophetess Devorah, when she helped her husband to make the wicks for the Mishkan that was in Shiloh, in Eretz Israel, before the temple was built, she helped her husband to make the wicks for the menorah in the Mishkan. She did it with such a focus and such a love for Hashem that she completely lost herself in it. And the Frierdiker Rebbe points out that that was one of the reasons that she merited to have this nevuah, to have this prophecy, because of that absolute dedication and focus to God in those moments. So this is the beautiful message that the Rebbe is giving us in terms of Hanukkah. It's not supposed to be every day, all consuming. And he says Hanukkah only lasts for 8 days. It's not the entire year. And therefore, we can choose moments where we choose to have that all-consuming focus on God and to lose ourselves in it. And so this Hanukkah, tomorrow night, when we light our menorah, we have the opportunity to look at the flames, to immerse ourselves in the blessings and the songs that are accompanied with it, and hopefully to completely be consumed by the opportunity to connect with God in this moment, the festival of lights. Okay, so I'll end with a story. It's not a Hanukkah story, but it is a miracle story, and that's what we are talking about. The miracles of Hanukkah that became so accessible at that time, or they just were so revealed at that time. So let's look at a miracle story from more contemporary times. The story is told by a woman who was a shlucha of the Rebbe, one of the Rebbe's emissaries. Her and her husband were shluchim in Australia. And the Chabad movement had just won a huge court case on a date called Hey Teves, which is the 5th of Teves, the month that is coming up after this month of Kislev. And there had been a conflict about who some of the books of Lubavitch actually belonged to. Because unfortunately there was one chassid actually from the Rebbitzins family, and he was taking many of these precious books and selling them for his own gain. And the Rebbe and the Hasidim brought a case that was heard in the United States courts to say that these books actually belong to the Hasidim. They belong to the Lubavitch movement. And on Hey Teves, the court found in favor of the Hasidim. And so it was a time of incredible joy and celebration. And the next day, the Rebbe made an announcement that anybody can make a request and send their request to the Rebbe, and he would take it to the ohel, to the resting place of his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, and he would put their request before his father-in-law, and he promised any request that is asked shall be fulfilled. Clearly he saw that in Shamayim it's a time of open flow. And so the shluchim throughout the world went to encourage everybody to come and send their requests to the Rebbe. And in fact, this couple in Australia, known as, I don't know their names other than that they were Rabbi and Rebbitzin HaSofer, they went and actually borrowed fax machines from one of the airlines in Australia so that as many people at that time as possible could send in their requests from Australia to the Rebbe. Now, Rebbitzin HaSofer was staying at that time with her father. And she said to him, why don't you put in a request? Her father was a Holocaust survivor. He had been a child in the Holocaust. And when anybody ever suggested anything connected to Judaism to him, he had one standard answer. Where was God during the Holocaust? He was so embittered and disillusioned and heartbroken by what he had seen and what he had experienced that he didn't want to know. And you can understand where he was coming from. So she asked him again, she encouraged him, Father, she said, put in a request, you have such an opportunity. And he was like, I'm not interested. So he just said to her, like as a joke, if you want to, you put in a request for me. Tomorrow I'm going fishing. Ask that I should get a good catch. As though saying, I'm not into this. The next day, he went fishing with a friend of his. They took their little boat. They went out into the sea. They actually passed an Italian fishing fleet on their way. And then they stopped and they lowered their fishing rods into the water. And this old man pulled out a fish. And a few minutes later, he pulled out another fish and another fish. And his friend was wondering, what's going on here? So he said to his friend, don't feel bad, don't worry. Let's swap places. I think I'm just sitting, I'm sitting in a better position. So they swapped places. And he lowered his line into the water and he pulled out a fish and another fish and another fish. And his friend caught nothing. So he said to him, really, really, don't feel disheartened. This is only happening because I got a blessing. And their whole boat became so filled with fish that they couldn't continue. And so they made their way back into shore, and the Italian fishing fleet, the fishermen said, where are you going? It's still so early. What's happening? They said, look at our boat. We can't possibly put any more fish in here. And one of the fishermen pointed to the heavens and said, you have got a special blessing today because we still haven't caught any fish. So this elderly man went and he knocked on his daughter's door, and she opened the door and he presented her with some fish. He said, I have to tell you what just happened. And he told her the story of his experience that morning. He was elated and he told her, you should prepare this fish for Shabbos. His daughter says that Saturday was the first Shabbat that he went to shul since he had been a child. And after that, every week he attended services. He became more and more involved in his Yiddishkeit. He became more and more involved with the community. And it ends that one day, two little boys were walking past this man who's a new face in the shul, and the one little boy said to the other, who is that guy? And his friend said to him, you see that guy? He had the opportunity to ask for a blessing for anything. And what did he ask for? Some fish. So, if you connected to a tzaddik, then you are connecting to God Almighty. Not because the tzaddik has any power of his own, but because the tzaddik is the vessel through whom God works in this world. And the job of the tzaddik is exactly as what happened in our story, to connect us, to help us, to reach out and open our hearts and become closer and more attached to the Almighty. And I hope that this Hanukkah, every single one of us feels our hearts are open and that we feel joy for the miracles that Hashem has done for us and anticipation for the miracles that still lie ahead. Thank you, ladies. Thanks for joining me. Thank you for these shiurim every week that we've been together, doing together. And please, God, everybody has a safe and wonderful and refreshing break. And I'll see you in January. Thanks for joining me. Thanks, ladies.